Welcome to one more edition of Politics Done Right. I'm Egberto Willies, your host. Today we're honored to have Abba A. Solomon. Abba Solomon is a former computer programmer and visual artist who was brought up in a secular home with a Jewish education. On summer visits to New York City in 2007 and 2008, he became interested in his parents' and grandparents' lives in New York, starting research at the New York Public Library and the American Jewish Historical Society. He encountered discussions of Zionism and Zionist literature of that time. I think it is apropos that in these times, we have a discussion with El Señor Abba A. Solomon. Welcome to Politics Done Right, Abba.
Thank you.
Now, let me ask you, before we even get started, exactly, and I want this in simple terms for my audience, what is Zionism?
That's a good question. Zionism is not necessarily even territorial. It is a belief that Jews around the world are a nationality, should nurture a common culture, and as part of it, there's a territorial component in the sense of there should be a homeland, a central place to pursue development of culture and identity. There's cultural Zionism you see in the revival of the Hebrew language. And there's also political Zionism, which was the belief in creating a political Jewish state. And that was not always Palestine, but it became Palestine very quickly, especially with the Balfour Declaration. But it's a belief in territorial reassembly, ultimately.
Now, let me ask you this then. First of all, you said territorial as well, not necessarily Palestine. Kind of give me some understanding on that, because I hear different stories, and it seems sometimes as if it had to be Palestine. Am I incorrect in that belief or not?
Yes, because that had the most connection historically. But at one point, the founder, basically the most well-known forefather or founding father of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, was dealing with the British on the idea of Uganda as a home. Also, Argentina. The idea was to find a place, because there was the pressures here were from Eastern Europe, were from under the Tsar, and oppression there in Poland, Ukraine, Russia, where since there was a deterioration, there was a lot of political ferment and repression, and Jews were in the way, or were in experiencing mob violence and persecution. And so there was an urgency for poor and persecuted Eastern Europeans to have a place of refuge.
Now, let me ask you this now. Tell me, and please, maybe I'll display some of my ignorance. What exactly is a Jew?
There is the religious definition, which is, the religious definition is people who have been a member of the Jewish community, recognized, who are born of a recognized Jewish mother. There are secular Jews. Half of the Jews in the world are not particularly religious, but there's a qualification. There's still that qualification. But it's become much more flexible in the 20th century in the sense of patrilineal rather than matrilineal parenting. But it is a paradoxical ethno-religious group that is ethnic, but also you can convert into. But it does not evangelize.
And the reason I ask that is the Jewish population have people who have, let's say, and I understand race is a social construct and all that sort of stuff. But now a particular group of Africans, I'm talking about Black pigmented Africans, got into the Jewish sect. We also have white pigmented Europeans into the Jewish sect, and we have those the what we would look at as Arab looking type folks that are into the Jewish sect. So Whereas, a Ugandan can probably say we have these particular characteristics that make us Ugandan. Is there any characteristic that makes a Jew, or is it just genetically, or is it just something that a religion mostly?
Oh, that's a hard one. There is research that purports to find that even among Ashkenazi Jews, Russian, Polish, can trace, or geneticists can trace back to Palestinian or
Lineage.
Judean origins. But you have, yes, I mean, it's a very confusing subject because you have Ethiopian Jews and you have Irish Jews.
Right.
But it's doctrinal, and it's a feeling internally of we are part of this culture. It's not racial. It is descendants of Abraham.
Okay.
And holders of the covenant.
Okay. Now, in that sense, as you explained, the Zionism is putting all this culture together, wanting to have a particular state. Now, as it was chosen, Israel was given a state, a piece of land, correct?
Do you mean historically or in the 20th century?
Well, I would rather historically to kind of know how it came from. Was there a Jewish state at any other time before 48?
Well, yes, there was Judea at the time conquered by the Romans, and conquered by the Romans, as we know in Jesus's time. Mm-hmm. But there had been, basically, there are periods, they figure about 500 years of Jewish kingdoms at the time. Yes.
And were they in one place? Were they in Palestine? Where were they?
Well, there was one, and then there was two kingdoms. Judea and Samaria is what we call the areas now. Mm-hmm. And the idea basically is that after the Romans and after rebellions against the Romans, there was diffusion of Jews throughout the world. The diffusion actually didn't start with the exile. There was a great Jewish community in Alexandria, in Egypt, in Rome, in Greece, in Greece, Greek possessions around the Mediterranean. So we've always been mobile.
Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to the formation of Israel now, can you explain to us how that came to be and what's the reality of that country per se?
Well, it's unique in the sense that it was an outgrowth of a number of forces. There was one that's very interesting, which is Christian Zionism, which became a thing in the 1800s, which was kind of a romantic idea and a religious idea that if Jews went back to Palestine and rebuilt the temple, that would mean something for Christians. That's one element that we still see around. It's an important force in the United States, Christian Zionism. But there was this great need in Eastern Europe for refuge. The United States and Canada, the North America was a great place, was an important refuge for people from Eastern Europe, Jews from Eastern Europe. But it also became, there was before Herzl and in the 1890s with Herzl, it became a fairly large or important movement in Eastern Europe among certain Jews that instead of being in this condition of persecution and minority status, that Jews could probably return to Palestine and build a homeland. And that homeland, that idea hooked in with British needs in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, where Balfour was where Britain was in a war. There was British need for American help, and there was a thriving American Jewish community, and there was the British Jewish community and a German and Russian Jewish community. And the idea was if they could get American Jews and Jews elsewhere on the British side, that could be to their advantage. And there's questions about how they made that promise. And they also made promises to Arabs they were negotiating with at the same time to offer, if they would unite against fighting the Turks, who the British were fighting with, then the Arabs would have sovereignty in various Arab lands. So they made a number of, and also they made a deal with the French, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. There's a great book, I think, titled the Twice Promised Land, talking about the British promises for Palestine and other lands of the Mideast. But the origin at that point, the promise the British made in the Balfour Declaration was for a homeland, but was not for a state. But from the Zionist point of view, for political Zionists, they felt that a state was the ultimate goal of that. And really 17, 28, 30 years later, 20 years later, they achieved the state in 48, declared it against the wishes of Palestinian non-Jewish residents of Palestine, and in a war that they had that really started in 47, drove away 750,000 non-Jews from the territory that became Israel.
So, in other words, that was what in the post-war era, that would have been the first genocide in the Palestinian area.
Yeah, ethnic cleansing, certainly.
Ethnic cleansing.
And so what you had was this young state in 48 of people who had been driven out into refugee camps in Jordan and Libya and Syria, basically. 750,000, enormous loss of population, but a big gain in land for the new Jewish settlers. And they needed that because, they felt they needed it because they needed to, there was war refugees from Europe. And also at that point, this poisoned the relationship between Jews and the Arab world. So there was a great migration of Jews in Morocco or Egypt or Syria or Lebanon to the new state of Israel. The important thing is that when all of this period from 1890 onwards, when the people started for the purpose of building a new Jewish community in Palestine, when they were emigrating to Palestine, the Jews, they were not emigrating to fit into the current society, to go find employment, participate in what was already there. This was a unique form of settler colonialism. For one thing, there wasn't a mother country that they were coming from, but it was also that they were settlers, not immigrants. They were not immigrants to participate in the country. They were there to build something new. And there was a taboo against economic cooperation and building enterprises jointly with Arabs. Of course, there was the linguistic differences because people who came there, they would learn Hebrew and not Arabic generally as the new language. So you were creating a parallel country, and that had great damage to any prospects in the future for cooperation.
And then, of course, and if I'm to understand that right, they came there to take something away from those who already had it, correct?
Well, they came and bought from absentee landlords, from perhaps Syrian owners or from Lebanon or whoever owned property that was tilled by local fedayeen, local peasants, tenant farmers. So that was one irritation, was that if they bought that to create Jewish-run farms or collectives and kibbutzim and moshavim, they were pushing out other people who then would lose their livelihoods. Yes, because they didn't have a concept that it was a functioning society that you were joining. It was simply available. This was still if you understand from the planning stages, and this was very Eurocentric, and then American Jews contributed a lot to this financially to donate. This was conceiving of Europeans and then the concept of natives in a pejorative sense. So they were not considered people to deal with in the sense of negotiate and find accommodation with, because there was, for instance, the authority of the British, who actually ran the place from 1917 to 1948. So the important people to deal with were the British, and not to find common cause with yes.
Now, so when we look at today, what has transpired today, is it then a battle that any country or any territory that gets occupied, is it not something that one would expect, that you would have this type of a battle over the lands that you've been on and maybe kicked off in whatever form?
I've thought about this a lot. The underlying philosophy of reassembling Jewish people in Palestine, there's an ultimate sense of vulnerability and a entitlement because of that vulnerability and historic tragedies, that it must be done, and eventually others will understand it.
That is, let's reflect that to the United States of America. How would that go if the natives in America felt that way for having been conquered, right?
Well, certainly. The parallel, by the way, the Israelis will, when you're talking with Israelis, they will say, how can you be on your high horse about this, from Australia, if you're from Australia or America or Canada, because the parallels are there. They say, why are we held to such a standard? And because our need is so great and our vulnerability is so great, and this, and they will say, this small piece of land in the middle of the Arab world, why can't they accept that we need this little bit? Now, it happens to be very key geographically, of course, and historically.
Yeah, and I find that ironic, because even today on one of my programs, I pointed out that really, I don't know that America has the moral authority to tell Netanyahu to stop doing what he's doing in Gaza, because, again, we've done that in Panama, we've done that in Iraq, we've done that in Afghanistan, but specifically, when it comes from a territorial point of view, we've actually done that right here in the United States. So, I mean, we opened ourselves to that argument, but my next question is, how do you not then empathize with those whose land another group of folks just come up and take? How do you not empathize? Is my question. Without someone stating that you're anti-Semitic.
Well, the entire mythology of settlements has always been you build. Well, the creation of the Israeli homeland settlements was you would build a fence and a stockade, and you'd have this safe place within, for the kibbutz, and you would have guards, and you would protect against depredations from the non-Jews who might come to steal or want to hurt you. Now, that psychology is writ large now, even though, this is a really complex situation, because 20% of the citizenry of Israel is not Jewish.
Right.
The Palestinian Israelis.
Right.
And they do have autonomy and the vote. Individual freedom and autonomy since 1966. Before then, they were under military rule, even within the country. But they have created a new Jew. That was the idea. Able to defend themselves. Now, this is an entirely different psychology than most American Jews, who don't feel under the same kind of threat unless they've adopted the militant nationalism idea that Jews can can never trust anybody, that ultimately everybody will turn on us. And if you push that idea that the identity itself means that we're always going to be betrayed, we're always under threat, and we'd better always have this safe harbor, and it must be mighty. That's why the whole idea of ever letting refugees back in '49 was never seriously considered, because the idea was majority meant safety. Jewish majority meant safety. Now, when Israel was accepted in the United Nations in 1949, they said they would follow Security Council Resolution 191, which said anybody who is willing to, yes, for Arabs of Palestine. And they said, well, of course, yes, we will follow that. It never was of any interest whatsoever to let anybody back, because, and what they will say now, what they're still saying about the right of return for Arabs is, well, then we wouldn't have our country anymore, in the sense of our majority Jewish country, which we must have for existential existence, for existential reasons.
That is a psychology that is hard. And you're Jewish, it seems to me like in the studies that you've been doing, you actually reject that psychology. Is that correct?
Oh yes. I mean, I think it's a dead end. I think it's a very it's understandable, but you've got to get past it. Is there's so many periods of Jewish history which are not tragedy and which are not persecution, and which do involve, especially in the Arab world, cohabitation and cooperation with Christians and Muslims, without it being, in other words, I don't think anybody can live that way.
And it is interesting because when you have the victimhood mentality that I don't know, maybe explain to me. I don't think it is. It's realized. Because I think, let's say, Black Americans could have that victimhood mentality, Native Americans could have that victimhood mentality, and all of this. I wonder sometimes if the victimhood mentality isn't something from that the elite has to maintain power and indoctrinate the others just so that they can maintain that power, and in the process, a hell of a lot of people get hurt. Is that a wrong assessment?
Oh, yes. No, in part, military and security industry in Israel is very important. It's their main, I believe now their main export to around the world is equipment they use for controlling populations and surveilling populations in the West Bank and Gaza. All of these surveillance drones and technologies for surveillance and control are big money. So that in a sense, it's just like in the United States. If we're not at war or Cold War at any time, that's a big financial loss.
Right. Absolutely. So wrapping this up, what's your hope? Because one of the things that I wanted to get from you before I spoke to Norman about what was happening from 48 going forward, I'd like to ask you, what do you think the ultimate solution is going to be? Can we change a mentality that really believes it's under persecution, in as much as I think a whole lot of people see the other side as the persecuted?
I'm thinking of James Baldwin, who talks about the importance of, or the function of fear and hate, because once you lose that, then you have to confront other things.
Right.
Nobody wants to feel like a victim or remember injuries. And if you can feel powerful instead and feel like you're fighting, then you don't have to think about what happened and process it. And for the early years, the Holocaust is not a popular subject in Israel, except as we mustn't let it happen again. But the vulnerability is very painful, the realization of having been vulnerable and that being a human condition. And you're never going to be without vulnerability if you're alive. I mean, maybe that's a little philosophical, but what in the early parts of this century, when the Zionists were trying to convince the American Jewish Committee and others to join the Zionist movement, the reaction of the leaders of a lot of American Jewish organizations was, this is fanatical and this is going to lead to conflict, because what about the other people who live there? And, there didn't seem to be any planning that this had to be acceptable and in cooperation with other people living in Palestine. Now they've gotten themselves into a jam where the only thing to do is to simply be more and more powerful and to have retaliation that always is more horrible than anything done to them, so that nobody will ever dare threaten. But you can see that now they're surrounded by a number of different forces that are making this course, leading towards Armageddon.
Does Israel go ahead.
Yeah, the left is very small in Israel now. The people who are likely to say something like, "These are other human beings. They're like us. We need to find commonality." And of course, the ironic thing is that the Palestinians and Jews are very similar. They're both highly motivated to learn. Education is high. They're not dissimilar cultures. There can be cooperative. Some sort of cooperative solution.
Well, I tell you one thing. I hope, Abba. I hope some of the things that you're frank about here will get some traction within the Israeli Jewish community, because I don't see an end to it at all. Again, I can't see a successful end for the Israelis at this point in time.
I wish I had more wisdom to share on this.
I think you had quite a bit of wisdom to share, because and I think our audience is going to get a whole lot out of an honest statement from somebody who grew up in a Jewish household, because there are very few that are willing to come out and make the statements that you have. So, Abba A. Solomon, thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right.
Thank you.
We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead. Number one, subscribe to our channel. And number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.